on the program outside, we have two substitutions of the last two talks in the morning. This first one is a presentation from Los Alamos by Kevin Odd entitled Reactivity and Stability of Titanium Silicate Catalysts. The two papers from the office in Italy were canceled after the program was put together. So Kevin gratefully acknowledged the presenting the paper, and following him, we're going to have a paper by Mark Barteau on the synthesis of ethers on silver surfaces. So please make a note of that. Okay, Kevin.
Thanks. Certainly appreciate the opportunity. So thanks to the chairs for allowing me to do this. If you're expecting to hear something about methane conversion, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say anything about methane conversion, but if you have an interest in how catalysts die by some rather unusual routes, you may find this somewhat interesting. I'm going to be talking about some comparisons between a few classes of titanium silicate catalysts this morning. Co-authors on this paper, John Rao, Francis DeReggi, and Andrea Laboria, all of Los Alamos. We've had this long interest in metal ions and frameworks at Los Alamos, where it focuses largely on structural characterization, both long-range and short-range order in these materials, using largely neutron scattering techniques to probe structures in these materials. And of course, along the way, we also do a fair amount of theory in these areas, trying to put together a picture of what titanium looks like in these particular silicate structures. Many of you know that these titanium silicate catalysts are of some interest, especially for the epoxidation of olefins with hydroperoxides. So a family of these materials, of course, perhaps the first and best known one might be the Shell titanium on silicate catalyst for the preparation of propylene oxide. But then about a dozen years or so ago, TS1 came on the scene, which is a zeolitic titanium silicate, which has some very unusual properties, being able to oxidize olefins in the presence of water. And this has spurred the search for larger core analogs and larger substrates, as well as larger oxidants, to be able to do epoxidations and other sorts of chemistry. And then there's some more recent information out of the literature on molecular analogs of these materials, these cyclopentadienyl titanium silicium molecular species. Now, I'll show you a little bit about those. These materials are made by a variety of different methods. For example, Shell's catalyst and, of course, titanium MCM have been prepared by grafting of titanium onto the support surfaces. Of course, the TS1 is made by, and as well as titanium beta, other titanium zeolites, made by isomorphous substitution of titanium into the zeolite frameworks. And of course, then these others down here at the bottom, the molecular titanium silicates. I'll tell you a little bit about those. Just to show you what these molecular titanium silicates look like, these were first described by Frank Fayer at Irvine. Cyclopentadienyl titanium at the corner of a cube of silicon. Okay, and each corner then has a cycloalkyl group on it, which renders these things soluble in solution. Then, let's see, somewhere I've got a different slide of Rutger Van Santen has shown that these materials, this is a copy of this Christmas card that many of you may have gotten a couple of years ago, shows that these complexes can be sorbed into MCM41. So he's effectively heterogenized these materials in the pores of MCM41. Okay, so a few details before we get started. These are a few features that will be useful to remember as we go through this thing. Activity in these titanium silicates for epoxidation is generally ascribed, and I think generally accepted to be due to isolated tetrahedral titanium 4 ions. Octahedral ions, microcrystalline TiO2 is inactive for these epoxidations. It appears that the silicon-oxygen titanium bonds in these materials, one of them at least, is cleaved with hydroperoxides and form a titanium 4 hydroperoxide intermediate, which then is involved in the attack on the substrate. Our solvents play a role in this, and they seem to activate hydrogen peroxide or alkyl hydroperoxides, but they're also involved in leaching and deactivation, or they appear to be involved in leaching and deactivation of these materials. Perhaps some of the best information on the mechanism of these reactions has been provided by Van Santen's group, where they look at this molecular species in solution using NMR techniques, and they can observe upon addition of TBO hydroperoxide that one of the SiO-Ti bonds is cleaved, although it probably remains coordinated to form this metallohydroperoxide. Addition of olefin that regenerates the resting state of the gas. And these materials are rather interesting. They're very, very active, more active than TS1 by maybe 10 or 20% in terms of turnover numbers. But they're also very stable, very thermally stable. You can boil these things up in 1 molar HCl for days without any loss of titanium. So as long as titanium is at least bound to a silicate framework by 2 or preferably 3 silicon-oxygen bonds, they seem to be very, very stable and resistant to leaching. Okay, how do we get here? Well, as I said earlier, we're interested in neutron scattering experiments. And to do these sorts of experiments, you don't want to mess around with poor materials. You want very, very best materials to look at these for these experiments. And so along the way, we have found some interesting influences of not only how you make these things, but also how they die. I'm going to skip right to the punchline here because I think it helps as we go through this thing understand what I'm trying to say. First, I'm going to tell you that leaching occurs in these materials depending on how they're made, but not for all of these materials. In other words, synthesis is important in determining if they'll lose titanium or not. But it turns out that the loss of titanium really isn't important. These things deactivate by a different pathway that does not have anything at all to do with the leaching. For those of you who are familiar with titanium MCM41 syntheses, the synthesis as reported by Thomas, where he prepares titanosyne dichloride, a modified material, and then calcines off the cyclopentadienyl rings to make an isolated titanium on the surface, is probably the best route to making nicely distributed titanium on any of these silicates. I'm also going to tell you something about the stability of the cyclopentadienyl titanium silicium coaxium absorbed into MCM41 that was originally reported by the Van Santen group. Some interesting observations in that he finds that it's stable, completely stable with respect to leaching in silicious MCM41. However, if you put some aluminum in the walls of MCM41, it leaches quantitatively. That arose our curiosity, and we've had a second look at these materials. And then finally, I'm going to end up by giving you a bit of a comparison between activity and stability amongst all of these titanium silicate materials. Okay, so let's jump into the MCM41s. A number of different routes have been used to prepare titanium in MCM41. MCM41, I'm sure you all know, is this rather bundle of soda straws where the walls of the silicate are amorphous and the holes are ordered. Korma first prepared this material using a framework synthesis where he involves titanium directly in the synthesis gel. And then, so in those cases, it's not unusual or not unreasonable then to think that some of the titanium indicated by these little black dots show up in the framework of the material and are unavailable for reaction. Also, because of these syntheses of titanium in the gel, one ends up with a fair amount of oligomeric titanium oxide on the surface, as can be determined by diffuse reflectance spectroscopy. One sees tends to see intensity out above 300 nanometers, indicating nanocrystalline TiO2 is present. One can also graft tetraethylorphotitanate, or reactive titanium alkoxide, onto the surface of previously prepared MCM41. And that, again, tends to end up producing small chunks of TiO2 as well. And that's, I'll just throw this slide up just momentarily. It's not unreasonable because tetraethylorphotitanate is not monomeric in solution. In fact, it's quite oligomeric, and so it's not unreasonable at all. And some of these oligomers are actually grafted onto the surface rather than monomers, and so one ends up with a large fraction of the titanium existing as oligomeric TiO2 units on the surface. That's going to be seen by diffuse reflectance and other techniques. And John Thomas and his group then found a better way, presumably, to put titanium down by grafting cyclopentadienyl titanium surface and then thermalizing off the cyclopentate family. It appears that per titanium, the activity is better for these cyclopentadienyl titanium grafted units, and we've had a little bit of a closer look at that. The way we go about examining these materials is we use the epoxidation of 1-hexene. We do this with T-butyl hydroxide under strictly anhydrous conditions. Do this in a dry box because these materials are easily poisoned by because of water that absorbs to the atom near the active site. Do this in dichloroethane, 2 hours at 80 degrees centigrade. So that's our standard test tokens. And typically under the conditions we look at, we see better than 99% selectivity to the epoxide. Not much diol in these cases. Okay, so here's basically what happens. One looks at this straight line here, which is, it's in green, but you probably can't tell. This is the framework synthesis. So as you add more and more titanium into the gel and make MCM41, one sees a fairly linear increase in the activity up to the point at which the synthesis fails. Somewhere out here around 3%, you can no longer make titanium MCM41. The presence of titanium seems to halt the formation of either the micelle or it inhibits the oligomerization of the silicate on the micelle. At any rate, you can no longer make the material here. Now, if one looks at the cyclopentadienyl titanium material, one sees a very rapid increase in activity at very low concentrations of titanium. And then beyond that point, one sees that the addition of more titanium results in no increase in activity. So it almost looks like there's two types of titanium. The first type, which is where all the activity occurs, and then you're putting more and more titanium on, which is apparently not appropriate appropriate geometry or whatever to give activity. The tetraethyl orthotitanate has the same sort of almost a titration curve appearance, however, at much lower activity. This is likely due to the coverage of active sites that are once formed, but then covered with oligomeric titanium from the tetraethyl orthotitanate that's still in solution. So for doing that, the good news is that for doing neutron experiments, one can probably pick this point right here and be reasonably sure that one is dealing with more or less one type of titanium on the surface. The bad news is it's at very low concentrations, and so that makes the experiments very difficult. So just to summarize the syntheses, framework synthesis, there's a linear increase in activity versus titanium loading. Probably as more and more material is made, there's a probability that some of the titanium is going to end up as mononuclear titanium-4 on the surface and is going to be active. A large fraction of it, however, is this oligomeric inactive material, and above 4% or so, one cannot make the material at all. Grafting, it appears that either there's different families of silanols on the surface that provide different reactivity and hence then different eventual activity for oxidation, or there's different sorts of titanium coordination geometries as one grafts. And grafting using oligomeric reagents yields oligomeric products, probably not surprising. Now, one of the interesting things comes as you recycle these materials. In any of these oxidation catalysts where one is doing liquid phase oxidations, one always needs to look for leaching of the material from the surface, and which potentially generates activity in the solution. And one then needs to be able to figure out what's heterogeneous catalysis and what's homogeneous catalysis in these cases. So what is typically done, and what we do, is we cycle these things by first running the reaction under for 2 hours, 75 degrees centigrade, again in strictly anhydrous conditions. Filter the material off hot, okay, so there's less likely chance of reabsorption of soluble species back onto the support. Analyze your products, and also analyze the solid, take a little bit out, analyze that, wash it, and then cycle it back. We do this 4 times, and what I'll show you now is some data about what happens here. Just for reference, look at TS1. One does this leaching experiment for TS1 and analyzes for titanium as a function of cycle. One sees no loss in titanium from TS1. This is pretty well known. TS1 is a fairly stable material. The deactivation that one sees is due to the buildup of oligomeric products in the pore system. All of the activity is restored if one calcines this material, so one can cycle this many times without appreciable loss in activity. Now, back to the MCM41s with titanium on them. These things all deactivate, and they deactivate fairly rapidly. We're losing 75% or so of the activity after just 3 to 4 cycles. The interesting thing is that they all appear to deactivate at about the same rate. If one plots this in a logarithmic fashion, the slopes of these lines are all about the same. So within some error, these things are probably deactivating at the same rate and perhaps deactivated by the same mechanism. It turns out that deactivation has nothing to do with loss of titanium. One looks at the framework material before and after 4 cycles. One loses 70% of the titanium from the material in bulk analysis. One looks at the tetraethyl material before and after. Again, this material loses about 25% of its activity, of its titanium while it loses activity. However, the material made by the cyclopentadienyl titanium grafting onto the surface doesn't lose any titanium at all, but it is still deactivated. Okay, so whatever the deactivation process is has nothing whatsoever to do with the loss of titanium. Now, the other thing is that the titanium that's being lost from these materials is inactive, so there is no solution activity whatsoever. So the titanium that is coming off is not mononuclear. It's likely to be small clusters of Ti2, nanoclusters of Ti2, which are known to be inactive for epoxidation. So it's likely that in these materials, what's coming off are simply the clusters that exist on the surface. Okay, if one then looks at the surface areas of the materials as a function of the cycling experiment, one sees that the surface areas and the pore volumes are all diminishing. Oh, I should go back and say that also this deactivation that I'm showing you is not restored by calcination. So this deactivation is not due to product buildup in the pores. Okay? It appears to be more associated with the loss of surface area and the loss of pore volume. Also, if one looks at the diffraction for these MCM materials, there's no measurable loss of order. So we don't believe that we're losing the order in the pore structure due to destruction of the pore structure as a function of cycling. But there is a slight decrease in the lattice spacing. These data, the pore symmetry data and the X-ray diffraction data, are consistent with simple densification of this material. In other words, the walls are growing thicker, the registry of the pores is very maybe not the same, but the walls appear to be getting thicker. So our mental picture right now of what's going on is that, for example, in the framework material, start with oligomeric material on the surface and maybe some material in the framework. The oligomers are leaching off of the surface. These materials are inactive, and it leaves behind only a few small fraction of the titanium on the surface, which is active. And again, the walls are growing thicker. So our guess is that these materials then are simply subsuming titanium sites. So titanium sites that were once active and on the surface are then being subsumed into the walls of the material. So for the titanate grafted material, again, we see clusters coming off, and again, loss of activity, shrinkage of the pores. And even for the cyclopentadienyl grafted material, we don't see any loss of titanium, but we see a loss of activity, up to 75% of the loss of the activity. Now, that's a nice cartoon, and it may make some sense. However, it would be nice to have some data as to where the titanium is really located in these materials. Of course, that's a tough problem. seeking out ways to examine where the titanium is. If the titanium is sitting on the surface, it's tetrahedral. If the titanium is sitting down in the wall of the silicate, it's also tetrahedral. And so the local geometry probably isn't going to change dramatically. So what we've done to look at is the utilization of paramagnetic NMR to tell us something about the location of the titanium. Our guess is that if it's on the surface, it's not a guess, we know this, titanium's on the surface, it's reducible. So we can go in and reduce the titanium-4 with carbon monoxide, reduce it to titanium-3, and then observe the silicon-29 NMR spectrum. And what I'm going to try to tell you is that the use of paramagnetic NMR is a valuable tool in determining what the nature of metals on and in frameworks is all about. So in the way, I'm going to make just take a minute or two here and defer to some alphas. One looks at the alpha 5 and cobalt alpha 5. One sees that the phosphorus spectrum is very diminished by the presence of the paramagnetic cobalt. Likewise, for TS1, in green is fresh titanium in TS1, unreduced. If you reduce it, reducing the titanium-4 to titanium-3 obliterates the silicon-29 spectrum almost completely. If one then reoxidizes, one gets all of the silicon-29 spectrum back. And even at very, very low concentrations of titanium, this is silicon to titanium of 120 to 1, one still obliterates some 80 to 90% of the silicon-29 spectrum. So if once silicon-29 is reduced, once titanium is reduced, the silicon-29 spectrum is removed. So if one does this then to these fresh versus cycled titanium MCM41s, the fresh material, if it's reduced, one loses all of the silicon-29 spectrum. Okay, so this is again the cyclopentadiene titanium grafted material, which we presume has all the titanium on the surface. So reducing the titanium removes all of the silicon spectrum. Okay. However, after cycling, if our guess is right, some of that titanium has gone down into the wall, where we presume it cannot be reduced by CO. Okay. So once that occurs, then, and we reduce it, we don't lose all of the silicon-29 spectrum. Okay. So we believe that this is consistent with our picture then, that the pores are shrinking, it's subsuming some of the titanium. The titanium is no longer available on the surface for the oxidation. The main points that I want to point out is that deactivation is independent of leaching. Deactivation is most likely to be responsible for densification of this material. I think this probably has implications for the use of MCM in general, that these very high surface area materials with high silane densities on them seem to have a propensity to densify, and that may have implications for using these things as in any case where you've got polar organic molecules around that are responsible for this densification. I wanted to say a few words about us cyclopentadiene titanium silicic-waxanes, but looks like we're going to be a little short on time. If there's anybody here that has some interest in cyclopentadiene titanium silicic-waxane and how it reaches or how it does not reach from MCM41, stop by here shortly after the talk. I'd be glad to talk to you about that. So at this point, I'll close and take any questions.
Chan from ABB Longs Global. It's a cartoon, it's okay. But in terms of densification, it will be the increase of density, but probably not a wall thickening. It's more due to packing of the particles being more condensed than the wall getting.
Yeah, I don't know how that's consistent with the loss of pore volume. It doesn't take much of a change in pore radius to reduce the pore volume substantially. So we actually see large changes in pore volume.
Yeah, I mean, that's how you measure it, but it can't be, I mean, it's hard to envision at such a low temperature so much of the materials being relocated, getting the wall thickening.
So it could be
that they're just being relocated material in a sense, on the larger scale, is reducing the pore volume.
Good. Yes, we see a slight decrease in E-spacing. It's not a dramatic change, but it's within probably a few percent, 5% decrease in total lattice spacing.
The second question is, you were saying that the deactivation is independent on the leaching problem. But you were showing that the activity is increasing linear with the titanium content, right? So it definitely has an impact on the activity, having the titanium content.
Well, what I didn't point out was that we start these deactivations all about the same titanium load, irregardless of how they compare. We start off with about half to 0.8% titanium. So we're not out on the plateaus of Bennington's curves. If we start with materials that are on these, okay, and then just look at loss of titanium below that point. So these aren't materials that are far out on the plateau. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Okay.
John Geus, Netherlands. I think the procedure for establishing the exposed titanium ions by reduction with CO and the NMR is an interesting technique. My question is the reduced titanium liable to reoxidize by exposure to atmospheric air?
Yeah. All we have to do is re-expose it. Is open the cap of the NMR rotor to do the reoxidation. These are very sensitive. They reoxidize very
So
rapidly.
after reduction, you have to close them from atmospheric air?
These are all done under strictly anaerobic conditions in a very good dry box.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a difficult experiment to do, but with a lot of practice, one can avoid reoxidizing.
So, Hedger from Organic, my question is sort of similar. Is there evidence that titanium is going from +4 to +3 during your reaction and that's accountable for the slope?
We have no evidence as to what the oxidation state is during the reaction, but people are aware of that. Generally, agree upon that titanium 4 is the stable oxidation state during and under reaction conditions for these oxidation reactions.
Thank you.
I was just curious if anybody had attacked the problem owing to controlled pore silicas, since the MCM41 material seems to have this curious property of deactivating due to some sort of structural change. You know, a primary particle of silica should be much more stable and not be subject to that sort of an issue.
I guess if one goes back to the shell catalyst, that's essentially what we're talking about. It's both silica. Behavior is very similar. They report initial aging followed by a slow deactivation thereafter, but very, very slow deactivation after the initial change. So, and that's just titanium on normal silica. I don't know any of the sort of controlled or class silicas.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin.